The air at Bagram airfield in Afghanistan was a thick cocktail of dust, jet fuel, and tension. It was a place where the line between life and death was drawn and redrawn every single day. For Captain Eva Rostova, it was also a place where she had to prove herself constantly, not just as a pilot, but as a female pilot flying the A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately and sometimes dismissively known as the Warthog. The A-10 wasn't sleek or fast like the F-16s that streaked across the sky with arrogant grace. It was a rugged, powerful beast, built around a GAU-8 Avenger cannon, a 7-barreled Gatling gun that could spit out 3,900 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary shells in a minute. It was a plane designed for one purpose: to get down and dirty, to provide close air support for the troops on the ground. It was Eva's metal angel, and she knew its every rivet, every groan, every roar. But to the elite of the elite, the Navy, SEALs of Team 6, Eva's Warthog was a joke. They were the tip of the spear, the ghosts who moved in the darkest corners of the world, and they were used to the lightning-fast support of fighter jets. In their eyes, the A-10 was a relic, a slow-moving target that was more of a liability than an asset. And a woman flying it? That was just another layer of doubt. The leader of this particular SEAL team, Lieutenant Commander Thorne, was the most vocal in his disdain. Thorne was a man carved from granite and arrogance, with a reputation for being the best, and he never let anyone forget it. He had a sharp jaw, eyes that seemed to see right through you, and a smirk that could curdle milk. He and his men called Eva Princess, a nickname that dripped with condescending poison. They'd say it just loud enough for her to hear as she walked past them in the mess hall, their laughter following her like a shadow. Eva never let it show. She had a spine of steel, forged in the fires of a childhood spent on a farm in rural Texas, where hard work was the only currency that mattered. She had fought for everything she had: her place at the Air Force Academy, her wings, and her assignment to the A-10, a plane she had fallen in love with for its sheer, unadulterated power and its sacred mission of protecting the soldiers below. She met their smirks with a cool, level gaze, and their snide remarks with a silence that was more formidable than any retort. She knew her worth, and she knew the worth of her plane. One day, they would too. That day came sooner than anyone expected. Chike's mission briefing was held in a sterile, windowless room, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and anxiety. A satellite map of a remote, treacherous valley in the Hindu Kush Mountains was projected on the screen. It was a labyrinth of jagged peaks and deep ravines, a place where the enemy had dug in deep, creating a fortress that was all but impenetrable. A high-value target, a notorious warlord, was confirmed to be in a compound deep within the valley. The mission was simple on paper, but a nightmare in reality. SEAL Team 6 was to infiltrate, capture, or kill the target and get out. But intelligence had failed them. The enemy was far more numerous and better equipped than anticipated. Thorne's team, designated Reaper 1, had walked into a trap. The voice of the base commander, a grizzled colonel with a face like a roadmap of past wars, was grave. "Reaper 1 is pinned down," he said, his words hanging heavy in the air. "They are surrounded, taking heavy fire from all sides, and their extraction route is cut off. They have multiple enemy anti-aircraft emplacements, including heavy machine guns and shoulder-fired missiles. We've already lost a drone trying to get a better look." He paused, letting the severity of the situation sink in. They need air support, and they need it now. But the valley is a death trap for our faster jets. The terrain is too tight for them to maneuver effectively, and the enemy is too entrenched. All eyes in the room turned to the only pilot who flew, a plane designed for this kind of insane, up-close and personal warfare. All eyes turned to Eva. A murmur went through the room. The A-10 was slow, making it a vulnerable target for anti-aircraft fire, but it was also incredibly maneuverable at low speeds and could loiter over a target area, delivering precise, devastating firepower. It was a double-edged sword. The colonel looked directly at Eva. "Captain Rostova, you're our only shot. Can you do it?" Before Eva could answer, Thorne's voice, patched in from the desperate firefight in the valley, crackled over the speakers. It was strained, but his arrogance was still intact. "Colonel, with all due respect, sending in a warthog is a suicide mission. We need something fast, something that can get in and out before they know what hit them. We don't have time for, scenic flight." The insult was clear, a direct shot at Eva and her plane. Eva's jaw tightened. She stepped forward, her voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to the crackle of gunfire coming from the speakers. "Colonel, the A-10 can handle it. I can handle it. I can get in low, use the terrain for cover, and provide the support they need." The colonel studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, Captain, you're up. Get your bird in the air. Reaper 1 is counting on you." As Eva turned to leave, Thorne's voice came over the radio again, this time with a bitter, resigned laugh. "Well, boys," he said to his team, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "it looks like the princess is coming to save us. Don't expect much. We're on our own." The words were like a slap in the face, but Eva didn't flinch. She walked out of the briefing room with her head held high, her mind already focused on the mission. The mockery, the insults, they were just noise. The only thing that mattered now were the lives of the men trapped in that valley. As she walked across the tarmac to her A-10, its hulking gray form looking like a sleeping beast, she gave it a pat on the nose. "Time to wake up, old girl," she whispered. "We've got work to do." The ground crew worked with a frantic, focused energy, loading the Warthog with a deadly arsenal of missiles, bombs, and thousands of rounds for the Avenger cannon. Eva went through her pre-flight checks with meticulous precision, her hands moving with a familiar, practiced grace. She strapped herself into the cockpit, the familiar scent of worn leather and electronics enveloping her. This was her sanctuary, her throne. As the canopy lowered, sealing her off from the world, she took a deep breath. The noise of the base faded away, replaced by the hum of the aircraft's systems. She was no longer Eva Rostova, the underestimated female pilot. She was Warthog 1, and she was going to war. The flight to the valley was tense. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the rugged landscape. The mountains rose up like jagged teeth, a formidable barrier between her and the trapped seals. As she approached the valley entrance, her radio crackled to life. It was Thorne. "Warthog 1, this is Reaper 1. We're marked by smoke. We're taking fire from all sides. Enemy positions are everywhere." His voice was tight, the arrogance replaced by a desperate urgency. "I see you, Reaper 1, Eva said, her voice a calm anchor in the storm of chaos. "I'm coming in." She pushed the stick forward, and the A-10 dove into the valley. The moment she crossed the threshold, the sky erupted. Tracer rounds, like angry red hornets, zipped past her canopy. The ground lit up with muzzle flashes from heavy machine guns. Her warning system shrieked as enemy combatants on the ridges locked onto her with shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. It was even worse than the briefing had described. It was a hornet's nest, and she had just flown right into the middle of it. She could see the green smoke marking the SEAL's position, a tiny island of hope in a sea of overwhelming enemy fire. They were trapped in a small rocky outcrop, completely exposed. She lined up her first gun run, her thumb hovering over the trigger. Her target was a fortified machine gun nest that was pouring a relentless stream of fire onto the SEAL's position. "Reaper 1, I'm engaging the machine gun nest on the eastern ridge," she said, her voice steady. "Copy that, Warthog 1, Thorne replied, his voice filled with a mix of desperation and disbelief that she had actually made it into the valley. Just as she was about to fire, a piercing tone screamed in her headset. Her threat display lit up like a Christmas tree. A missile lock, a serious one. It was coming from her 6 o'clock, fast and low. She had seconds to react. She slammed the stick to the side, pulling the A-10 into a gut-wrenching high-G turn, deploying flares to decoy the incoming missile. The SEALs on the ground watched in horror as the missile streaked towards her plane. Over the radio, all they heard was Eva's calm, measured voice, a voice that betrayed no hint of fear. Evasive maneuvers. Then a bright flash, a deafening explosion that echoed through the valley, and the sickening sound of tearing metal. Her radio went silent. On the ground, Thorne stared at the fireball in the sky where the A-10 had been, his heart sinking like a stone. The princess was gone, and so was their last hope. Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the rocky outcrop where SEAL Team 6 was making their last stand. The only sounds were the crackle of enemy gunfire, which seemed to intensify with a renewed, triumphant vigor, and the frantic, ragged breathing of the men who were now certain they were going to die. The fireball in the sky had vanished, leaving behind a trail of black smoke that was quickly swallowed by the deepening twilight. The A-10 was gone. Their air support, their one desperate long shot at survival, had been swatted from the sky. In a matter of seconds, Lieutenant Commander Thorne fell back against a rock, the radio handset slipping from his grasp. A cold, hollow feeling spread through his chest. It wasn't just the despair of a mission gone horribly wrong, it was the bitter taste of guilt. Princess. The name echoed in his mind, his own voice mocking, arrogant, dismissive. He had scoffed. At her plane. He had told his men not to expect anything, and she had flown into the very jaws of death for them. For him. Now she was a smear of burning wreckage somewhere in the valley, and they were next. "They're coming!" one of his men shouted, his voice cracking with a fear that no amount of training could suppress. The enemy, emboldened by the downing of the American jet, was advancing, their triumphant shouts echoing off the canyon walls. The SEALs checked their ammunition. It was dangerously low. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely cut off. This was it. This was how it ended. Thorne picked up his rifle, his face a grim mask of resignation. They would sell their lives dearly, but they would sell them nonetheless. He chambered around, the metallic click sounding like a death knell in the twilight. "On me!" he yelled, preparing to lead a final, hopeless charge, and then it came. A sound so alien, so terrifying, so utterly beautiful that it froze every man on the battlefield, friend and foe alike. It wasn't the supersonic crack of a fighter jet. It was a deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth, a sound that vibrated in their bones and rattled their teeth. It was the sound of a gay U-8 Avenger cannon opening its mouth and speaking in a language of pure, unadulterated destruction. Bert! A stream of 30mm tracer rounds, glowing like a river of molten lava, painted a line of fire across the enemy position on the eastern ridge. The machine gun nest that had been tormenting the SEALs for hours simply vanished in a spectacular explosion of rock, metal, and bodies. The ground shook, the air crackled. The triumphant shouts of the enemy turned into screams of terror and confusion. The SEALs stared, their mouths agape, their eyes wide with disbelief. Thorne slowly lowered his rifle, his gaze fixed on the sky. Out of the smoke and shadows, like a vengeful angel rising from the ashes, the A-10 emerged. It was scarred and battered, with a gaping hole in one wing and black smoke trailing from an engine, but it was flying, and it was angry. "Warthog 1 to Reaper 1. Eva's voice impossibly, miraculously crackled back to life over the radio. It was still calm, still steady, but now there was an edge to it, a cold, hard fury. "Sorry for the delay. Had to shake a little turbulence. Now where were we?" A wild, incredulous cheer erupted from the SEALs. Hope, which had been extinguished only moments before, flared back to life, brighter and more intense than ever. Thorne fumbled for his radio, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Warthog 1, you're alive. We saw... Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated, Reaper 1. Eva cut in, her voice tight with concentration as she banked the wounded plane hard, dodging another volley of ground fire. "Now, I'm a little banged up and I'm burning fuel fast, so let's make this quick. I need targets. Light 'em up for me." What followed was a masterclass in aerial warfare, a brutal, beautiful ballet of destruction. Ava became a ghost in the valley, a phantom that defied all logic and expectation. She used the deep ravines and jagged peaks as her personal playground, disappearing behind a ridge only to reappear seconds later from a completely different direction, the roar of her cannon heralding her arrival. The enemy, who had been so confident just moments before, was thrown into chaos. They couldn't get a lock on her. She was too low, too unpredictable, too damn good. She painted the valley in tracer fire, a group of enemy fighters trying to flank. The SEAL's position was erased from existence by a perfectly placed cluster bomb. A mortar team setting up on a high ledge was vaporized by a Maverick missile. One by one, with methodical, surgical precision, she dismantled the enemy's defenses. She was no longer just a pilot. She was an artist, and the valley was her canvas, her masterpiece, a symphony of fire and steel. The SEALs, who had been on the brink of annihilation, were now spectators to their own salvation. They watched in awe, calling out targets, their voices filled with a reverence that bordered on worship. The woman they had mocked, the pilot they had dismissed, was single-handedly turning the tide of a battle that had been hopelessly lost. Thorne, the arrogant commander, was humbled. He watched the wounded warthog dance through the storm of fire, its pilot a testament to a kind of courage he had never witnessed before. He had been wrong, so profoundly, utterly wrong. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes, Eva owned the valley. She was a wounded angel, flying a battered chariot of war, and she was magnificent. But even angels have their limits. A warning light flashed on her console. Fuel. It was critically low. Another light blinked urgently. Ammunition. The great Avenger cannon was almost empty. She had just enough for one more pass. "Reaper 1, this is Warthog 1, she said, her breathing now slightly labored. "I'm on my last gun run. I'm almost out of gas and bullets. I'm going to clear a path for you to the west. There's a dry riverbed there. It should provide you with some cover for extraction. You need to move now." "We copy, Warthog 1, Thorne replied, his voice thick with gratitude. "We're moving. Thank you, Eva, thank you." It was the first time he had used her name. "Just get your men out of there, Commander," she said. "That's all the thanks I need." She banked the A-10, lining up for her final attack on a heavily fortified enemy position that was blocking the SEAL's escape route. The plane groaned in protest, the damaged wing making it difficult to control. She ignored the warning alarms screaming in her cockpit. This had to be perfect. The lives of those men depended on it. She focused on the target, her finger tightening on the trigger. But the enemy had one last surprise. They had been waiting, holding back their most advanced weapon. As Eva flew low and steady for her final run, a new, more sophisticated anti-aircraft system hidden in a cave on the valley wall came online. It wasn't the simple shoulder-fired missile that had nearly taken her down before. This was a radar-guided, multi-missile launcher, faster and deadlier than anything she had faced. Her threat display went insane, a cacophony of alarms and flashing red lights. "Missile lock! Missile lock!" the automated voice screamed in her headset. But it wasn't just one lock, it was 3. On the ground, the SEALs, who had just started moving towards the riverbed, looked up in horror. They saw it. 3 streaks of white smoke moving with terrifying speed, converging on the wounded A-10 from different directions. There was no time to evade, no room to maneuver. It was a perfect trap. They could only watch, helpless, as the missiles closed in on their guardian angel, their last hope, about to be extinguished for good. The world inside Eva's cockpit became a chaotic symphony of screaming alarms and flashing lights. 3 missiles, 3 points of death converging on her wounded bird. Her training took over, her mind a cold, calculating machine processing 1,000 variables in a split second. There was no escape, not in the traditional sense. She couldn't outrun them, and with her damaged wing, she couldn't outmaneuver them. So she did the one thing they wouldn't expect. She flew right at them. She slammed the throttle forward, pushing the battered A-10 to its absolute limit, and pointed its nose directly at the lead missile. At the last possible second, she deployed her remaining flares and broke hard, a violent, gut-wrenching maneuver that sent a shockwave of protest through the aircraft's frame. The first missile, confused by the flares and the sudden change in direction, shot past her, exploding harmlessly against the valley wall. The second missile, however, was smarter. It adjusted its course, but Eva's violent turn had thrown off its trajectory just enough. It skimmed past her tail, close enough for her to feel the heat of its rocket motor. But the third missile was a killer. It anticipated her move. As she leveled out from her break, it was right there, waiting for her. She had no more tricks, no more flares, no more time. She braced for impact, her hands gripping the controls, her knuckles white. The missile slammed into her already damaged right wing. The explosion was catastrophic. It felt like the hand of God had swatted her from the sky. The A-10 was thrown into a violent, uncontrollable spin, plummeting towards the valley floor. The cockpit was a blur of spinning earth and sky. Alarms shrieked in a final, deafening chorus. The controls were dead in her hands. The plane was coming apart around her. This was it. This was how it ended. But Eva Rostova was not the kind to give up. Not ever. Through the sheer force of will, she fought the spin. She used the rudder pedals, the one control surface that still had some response, to counteract the deadly spiral. The G-forces were crushing, threatening to black her out, but she held on, her vision tunneling, her body screaming in protest. Slowly, miraculously, the spin began to slow. The A-10 was still, falling, but it was no longer tumbling. It was a falling leaf, not a stone. She had control, barely. The right wing was a mangled wreck, and the engine on that side was on fire. She couldn't climb. She couldn't maintain altitude. The only direction she could go was down. Her eyes scanned, the rugged terrain below, searching, desperate. And then she saw it. A small, relatively flat stretch of land next to the dry riverbed she had been trying to clear for the seals. It wasn't a runway. It was a death trap. But it was her only chance. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!" she choked into her radio, her voice strained with the effort of keeping the plane level. "Warthog 1 is going down. I repeat, Warthog 1 is going down." On the ground, Thorne and his men had watched the horrifying spectacle, their hearts in their throats. They had seen the explosion, the spin, the terrifying plunge. They had assumed she was gone. But then her voice, strained but alive, came over the radio. A wave of disbelief and awe washed over them. She was still fighting. "I see a clearing," Ava's voice crackled again, attempting a controlled crash landing. A crash landing? In there? "She's insane," one of the SEALs muttered, staring at the tiny patch of land she was aiming for. It was littered with rocks and scrub brush, a suicidal choice. Thorne grabbed his binoculars, his hands shaking slightly. He watched as the A-10, a wounded, smoking beast, descended towards the clearing. It was a masterful display of flying, a testament to the pilot's incredible skill and iron nerve. She was fighting the plane every step of the way, keeping it level, bleeding off speed, trying to turn a certain death into a possible survival. The plane hit the ground hard. The landing gear, which she hadn't been able to deploy, sheared off on impact. The A-10 skidded across the rocky ground, shedding pieces of its fuselage, its wings digging into the earth, sending up a massive cloud of dust and debris. It slid, for what seemed like an eternity before finally, with a final violent shudder, it came to a stop, its nose buried in the side of a small hill. For a moment, there was silence. The dust clouds slowly began to settle. Was she alive? Had she survived? Then they saw it. The cockpit canopy slid open. A small figure, moving with a pained slowness, climbed out and dropped to the ground. It was Eva. She was alive. A cheer went up from the SEALs, a raw, emotional outburst of relief and admiration. But their celebration was short-lived. The crash had not gone unnoticed. From all over the valley, enemy fighters like ants to a picnic began to converge on the crash site. They knew there was a survivor, an American pilot, a prize of immense value. Eva knew it too. She was injured. Her arm was bleeding, and her leg was screaming in protest, but her survival instincts were razor sharp. She grabbed her survival pack, her sidearm, and a small submachine gun from the cockpit. She didn't have much time. She had to get away from the crash site before they swarmed her. She limped away from the wreckage of her beloved Warthog, melting into the shadows of the rocks and scrub brush just as the first enemy fighters arrived. Back at the SEAL's position, Thorne was facing an impossible choice. The path to their extraction point was now clear, thanks to Eva's last gun run. Their orders were to get out, to save themselves. The mission was over, but Thorne couldn't do it. He couldn't leave her behind. He watched through his binoculars as Eva disappeared into the terrain, and as the enemy forces closed in on her last known position, he made a decision that would either get him a medal or a court-martial. "All right, listen up," he barked at his men, his voice filled with a new, unshakable resolve. "The mission has changed. Miller, you take the rest of the team and proceed to the extraction point. Stick to the plan. We'll cover you." Miller, his second-in-command, stared at him in disbelief. "Sir, what are you talking about? Our orders are to—" "I'm talking about the pilot who just saved our asses." Thorne cut him off, his eyes blazing with an intensity Miller had never seen before. "She's down there alone and wounded. We are not leaving her behind. Not now, not ever." He turned to his two most trusted men, a massive breacher named Tank and a quiet, deadly sniper named Ghost. "You two are with me. We're going to get our pilot." It was a reckless, insane, and completely unauthorized plan. They were low on ammo, exhausted, and they would be going deeper into enemy territory, against overwhelming odds. But looking at the determination on their commander's face, and thinking of the pilot who had flown through hell for them, Tank and Ghost didn't hesitate. They nodded in unison. "Miller," Thorne said, his voice softer now, "get the team out. That's an order. And when you get back, you tell them we need a quick reaction force. Tell them there's an angel in this valley and we're going to bring her home." Miller hesitated for a moment, then nodded, a look of grudging respect on his face. "Good luck, sir." As Miller and the main group of SEALs began to move towards the extraction point, Thorne, Tank, and Ghost turned in the opposite direction towards the crashed A-10. They moved with a deadly, silent purpose, melting into the shadows, becoming the hunters in a valley where they had so recently been the hunted. The last thing Miller heard as he moved away was Thorne's voice, low and determined, speaking into his radio. "Warthog 1, this is Reaper 1. We're coming for you. Just stay alive." The valley had become a hunting ground, and Eva Rostova was the prey. Her body was a symphony of pain. Her left arm was a mess of deep cuts from the shattered canopy, and every step sent a jolt of agony through her right leg, which she was sure was fractured. But pain was a luxury she couldn't afford. Fear was a weight she refused to carry. All she had was the mission: survive. She moved through the twilight, a ghost in the landscape of rocks and thorny bushes. Her flight suit was torn and stained, with dirt and blood, but her mind was clear, her senses on high alert. Every rustle of the wind, every dislodged pebble, every shadow that seemed to move was a potential threat. She was no longer a pilot. She was an animal, relying on pure instinct and the brutal, effective survival training that had been drilled into her. The enemy was close. She could hear their shouts, their dogs barking as they picked up her scent. They were fanning out, a net of hunters closing in on her. But Eva was not just prey. She was a predator in her own right. She had her sidearm, a submachine gun with a few precious magazines, and a knife. More importantly, she had her mind. She wasn't just running. She was thinking, planning, turning the terrain into her ally. She found a narrow ravine and used it to mask her trail, wading through a trickle of muddy water to throw the dogs off her scent. She set a small, simple trap using a tripwire from her survival kit and a fallen branch, not designed to kill, but to slow them down, to make them cautious, to sow confusion and fear. She was leaving a trail, but it was a trail of her own making, leading her hunters into a dance of her own design. Meanwhile, Thorne, Tank, and Ghost were moving with a lethal grace that defied the rugged terrain. They were shadows with rifles following the signs of the hunt, but they weren't tracking the enemy. They were tracking Eva. Thorne had seen enough to know she wouldn't be an easy catch. He found the discarded, blood-soaked piece of her flight suit she had used to bandage her arm. He saw the faint, almost invisible tracks that led away from the obvious paths. He found the triggered tripwire and the frustrated shouts of the enemy patrol that had stumbled into it. "She's good," Ghost whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "She's thinking like one of us. She's better than one of us, Thorn replied, a deep, newfound respect in his voice. She's wounded, and she's still playing games with them. They pushed on, the urgency growing with every passing minute. They knew Eva couldn't keep this up forever. Her injuries would slow her down, and the enemy's numbers were overwhelming. They had to get to her before the net closed completely. They followed the trail of chaos she was leaving in her wake, a trail that led them towards a cluster of abandoned mud brick buildings on the valley floor, a ghost village that was about to become a battlefield. Eva reached the village just as her strength was beginning to fail her. Her leg was on fire, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. She stumbled into the nearest building, a crumbling structure with a collapsed roof, and sank to the floor, her back against the cool mud. Well, she was cornered. She could hear the enemy closing in from all sides, their voices growing louder, more confident. They knew they had her trapped. She checked her submachine gun. 1 magazine left. She pulled out her pistol. A few more rounds. It wasn't enough. Not against so many. She took a deep breath, steadying her shaking hands. If this was where she was going to die, she would die fighting. She would make them pay for every inch of this dusty, forgotten room. The first enemy fighter appeared in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the fading light. He raised his rifle, a triumphant grin on his face. Before he could fire, a single suppressed shot cracked through the air, and he dropped like a stone, a neat hole appearing in the center of his chest. More shouts. Confusion. The enemy didn't know where the shot had come from. 2 more fighters rushed the doorway, and they were met with a short, controlled burst of automatic fire. Not from Eva's gun, but from a different position. It was Tank laying down covering fire from a building across the narrow alleyway. Suddenly, the firefight was on. It was a chaotic, brutal, close-quarters battle. Thorn, Tank, and Ghost had launched their surprise attack, a perfectly coordinated assault that threw the enemy into disarray. They were outnumbered 20-1, but they were SEALs. They fought with a ferocity and precision that was terrifying to behold. Eva, seeing her chance, joined the fray. From her position inside the building, she fired her submachine gun in short, disciplined bursts, picking off targets of opportunity, adding to the chaos. For a few precious minutes, the tide turned. The hunters became the hunted. But the enemy was too numerous. They regrouped, their initial shock turning to rage. They began to surround the village, cutting off all escape routes. The firefight intensified, bullets chewing through the mud brick walls, the air thick with dust and the smell of cordite. In the chaos of the battle, Thorn saw a group of enemy fighters maneuvering to flank Tank's position. "Tank, on your left!" he yelled into his radio. But it was too late. A rocket-propelled grenade slammed into the building Tank was in, the explosion tearing a huge hole in the wall. "Tank is down! I think he's hit!" Ghost's voice crackled over the radio. Thorn's blood ran cold. He had to get to his man. He broke cover, running across the open alleyway, laying down a stream of suppressive fire. Eva saw what was happening. She saw Thorn, alone and exposed, running towards his fallen comrade. She saw a new group of enemy fighters taking aim at him from a rooftop. Without a second thought, she left the relative safety of her building and ran out into the open, her submachine gun blazing, drawing the fire away from Thorn. It was a selfless, suicidal act. Bullets kicked up the dust around her feet. One tore through the fleshy part of her shoulder, spinning her around. She cried out in pain, but kept firing, her last magazine now empty. Thorn reached Tank, who was alive but badly wounded, and began dragging him back towards cover. He looked up and saw Eva, alone in the middle of the alley, her gun empty as the enemy closed in on her. "Eva, no!" he screamed. At that moment, a new wave of enemy fighters poured into the village, cutting Thorn and Eva off from Ghost and the wounded Tank. They were trapped, separated from the rest of their small team. Thorn shoved Eva towards the nearest building, the same one she had been in before, and followed her inside, firing his rifle to keep the enemy at bay. He slammed the rickety wooden door shut, just as a hail of bullets splintered it. They were trapped. The small room was dark, the only light coming from the muzzle flashes outside. They could hear the enemy shouting, massing for a final assault. Thorn leaned against the door, his chest heaving, his rifle nearly empty. Eva slumped against the wall, clutching her bleeding shoulder, her own weapon useless. They were surrounded, out of ammo, and completely, utterly alone. The hunters had finally closed their trap. The small dark room was a crucible of fear and desperation. Outside, the shouts of the enemy grew louder, a rising tide of imminent violence. Inside, there were only two people, a Navy SEAL commander and an Air Force pilot, two warriors from different worlds, now bound together by a shared, desperate fate. The air was thick with the smell of dust, blood, and gunpowder. Thorn leaned against the splintered door, his rifle held loosely in his hands. He was down to his last magazine. He looked over at Eva, who was slumped against the far wall, her face pale in the dim light, her hand pressed tightly against her bleeding shoulder. The arrogant smirk he always wore was gone, replaced by a look of grim reality. The princess he had mocked had just saved his life, running into a hail of bullets for him. The weight of his own foolishness, his own prejudice, came crashing down on him. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and hoarse. Eva nodded, wincing as a fresh wave of pain shot through her shoulder. "I'll live," she said, her voice strained. For another 5 minutes anyway, a heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the sounds of the enemy massing outside. Thorn pushed himself off the door and walked over to her. He knelt down, pulling a medical kit from his vest. "Let me see that," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. She didn't protest. She let him cut away the torn fabric of her flight suit and examine the wound. It was a clean through and through, but it was bleeding badly. His hands, which had only ever known the cold steel of a weapon, were surprisingly gentle as he cleaned and bandaged the wound. "I was wrong about you," he said quietly, his eyes focused on his work. "Everything I said, everything I thought. I was a fool." He finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm sorry, Eva." Eva looked at him, at this man who had been her tormentor, now her unlikely ally. She saw the genuine remorse in his eyes. "Forget it, Thorn," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "None of that matters now." "It matters to me," he insisted. "You flew into hell for us. You never gave up. And then, out there, you saved my life." "You came back for me," she countered. "You didn't have to do that." A grudging respect, forged in the crucible of combat, began to form between them. They were no longer a SEAL and a pilot, a man and a woman. They were just two soldiers, trapped behind enemy lines, with their backs against the wall. And they weren't done fighting yet. "We need a plan," Thorn said, his voice regaining some of its command. "They're going to breach that door any second." Eva's mind, sharp and strategic even through the pain, kicked into gear. "The roof," she said, looking up at the partially collapsed ceiling. "It's unstable. If we can bring it down on them when they come through the door." It was a desperate long-shot plan, but it was the only one they had. Working together, they began to prepare their trap. Thorn used his knife to weaken the main support beam, already cracked and splintered from age. Eva, using her one good arm, gathered loose rocks and debris, piling them up on the weakened section of the roof. They booby-trapped the entrance with the last of their explosives, a small claymore mine Thorn had been saving for a last resort. They worked in a strange, silent harmony, their movements economical and precise. They shared stories in hushed tones, not of war and battles, but of home. Thorn talked about his son, who he hadn't seen in over a year. Eva talked about her family's farm in Texas, the wide open spaces, the smell of rain on the dusty ground. For a few brief moments, they weren't just soldiers, they were people, clinging to the memories of a life that seemed a million miles away. The sound of a battering ram hitting the door brought them crashing back to reality. The wood groaned, splintering under the force of the blows. It wouldn't hold for long. "Get ready," Thorn said, taking up a position behind a pile of rubble, his rifle aimed at the door. Eva crouched beside him, her pistol in her hand, the small submachine gun now just a useless piece of metal. The door burst open with a deafening crash. Enemy fighters, their faces contorted with hate, began to pour into the room. Thorn detonated. The claymore. The explosion was devastating in the confined space, a brutal wave of shrapnel and concussive force that took out the first wave of attackers. But more kept coming. They swarmed into the room, firing wildly. Thorn and Eva opened fire, their last few rounds finding their marks. But it was like trying to hold back the tide with a teacup. There were too many. A bullet struck Thorn in the leg, and he went down with a cry of pain. Another ricocheted off the wall and hit him in the side, knocking the wind out of him. He was seriously injured, his rifle now empty. Eva scrambled to his side, firing her pistol until the slide locked back. Empty. They were out of ammunition. They were defenseless. The enemy fighters paused at the doorway, sensing their victory. They advanced into the room, their rifles leveled at the two trapped Americans. It was over. Thorn, lying in a pool of his own blood, looked at Eva. He managed a weak, grim smile. "It was an honor serving with you, Captain," he choked out. Eva met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a defiant fire. She was not afraid. She had done her duty. She had saved her comrades. She closed her eyes, ready for the end. And then a new sound cut through the chaos. A sound that was both familiar and utterly out of place. It started as a faint, distant whisper, then grew rapidly into a thunderous, rhythmic chopping. It was the sound of helicopter rotors. The enemy fighters heard it too. They looked up, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the village. Through the hole in the roof, they could see them. Two Black Hawk helicopters, bristling with guns, swooping in low over the village. The quick reaction force. Ghost and Tank had made it. They had brought help. But were they in time? The enemy commander, realizing his prize was about to be snatched from his grasp, screamed an order. "Kill them! Kill them now!" The fighters raised their rifles for the final killing shots. At the same moment, Thorn, with the last of his strength, reached for the weakened support beam and pulled. The roof groaned, shuddered, and then, with a deafening roar, it gave way. The entire structure collapsed inwards, a massive avalanche of mud brick, timber, and rock, burying Eva and the wounded Thorn under tons of debris. The world went black. Dust. Choking, suffocating dust filled Eva's lungs. Her world was a dark, crushing weight. The roar of the collapsing building was replaced by a ringing in her ears and the terrifying sound of her own ragged breathing. She was trapped, buried, alive. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat, but she fought it down. She was a pilot. She was a survivor. She would not die in the dark. She tried to move, but she was pinned, her legs trapped under a heavy wooden beam. She could hear Thorn groaning nearby, a pained, shallow sound. "Thorn," she called out, her voice a dry, dusty croak. "Are you with me?" "Here," he coughed, his voice weak. "Can't move. I think my leg is broken." Above them, the sounds of battle raged. The thunder of the Black Hawk's miniguns, the crackle of automatic rifle fire, the shouts of soldiers. The rescue had arrived. But they were still trapped, their lives measured in the shallow breaths they took in their dusty tomb. Then, a new sound. The scraping of shovels, the splintering of wood, the shouts of American voices. "Over here! We got 'em! They're in here!" It was Ghost. They were digging. Frantically, desperately, they were digging them out. A sliver of light broke through the darkness. Then another. Hands, strong and determined, began to pull away the debris. Finally, they were free. Eva and Thorn were pulled from the rubble, battered, bleeding, and covered in a thick layer of dust, but gloriously, miraculously alive. They were loaded onto a helicopter, the blades whipping up a storm of dust as it lifted off, leaving the shattered village and the defeated enemy behind. The mission, against all odds, was a success. The flight back to Bagram was a blur of pain and relief. Medics worked on them, patching their wounds, their voices a calm, reassuring presence in the noisy cabin. Thorne, despite his injuries, refused painkillers. He needed a clear head. He had a report to make. The story of what had happened in the valley spread through the base like wildfire. The tale of the lone A-10 pilot who had flown into a death trap, who had been shot down, and who had not only survived but had fought on the ground alongside the very men she had saved. It became a legend. Eva Rostova, the woman they had called Princess, was now known by a new name, the Angel of Bagram. Thorne, from his hospital bed, made his official report. He left nothing out. He detailed his own team's failures, his own arrogance, and most importantly, Captain Rostova's unparalleled skill and heroism. He made it clear, in no uncertain terms, that every single member of his team owed their life to her. He officially recommended her for the Air Force Cross, the second highest award for valor in combat. The mockery and insults that had once followed Eva around the base were replaced by looks of awe and respect. Pilots, soldiers, and even the gruff mechanics who worked on the planes would stop and salute her as she passed. She was no longer just a pilot. She was a hero. But the accolades meant little to her. The only thing that mattered was that she had done her job. She had brought her soldiers home. Months later, the war in Afghanistan was a memory. The dust and the danger had been replaced by the green grass and manicured lawns of a military base in the United States. A formal award ceremony was being held in a large, polished hangar. Eva stood at attention, her dress uniform immaculate, her posture perfect. She felt out of place. The quiet heroism of the battlefield felt a world away from the pomp and circumstance of the ceremony. The citation for her Air Force Cross was read aloud, detailing her incredible bravery. When it was finished, the general who was presenting the award stepped aside. In his place stood Lieutenant Commander Thorne. He was in his own dress uniform, walking with a slight limp, the only visible reminder of the battle that had forged their unlikely bond. He took the medal, its silver gleam, catching the light. He stepped in front of Eva, his eyes meeting hers. The arrogance was gone forever, replaced by a deep, abiding respect. He pinned the medal to her chest, his movements precise and deliberate. The hangar erupted in applause, a thunderous ovation that went on and on. In the midst of the noise, Thorne leaned in close, his voice for her alone. "You didn't just paint hope in tracer fire, Captain," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You redefined it. Thank you." Eva simply nodded, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in a long time. "Just doing my job, Commander," she whispered back. The final scene of the story takes place a year later. Eva, now a decorated hero and a seasoned combat veteran, is an instructor pilot at an Air Force base in Arizona. She stands on the flight line, the hot desert sun beating down, watching a new generation of A-10 pilots prepare for a training flight. A young, cocky male pilot, full of the same arrogant confidence she had once seen in Thorne, walks by. He looks at the A-10, then at Eva, a dismissive smirk on his face. "It's a great plane, ma'am," he says, his tone condescending. "If you've got all day to get to the fight." Eva doesn't get angry. She doesn't correct him. She just smiles, a quiet, knowing smile that holds the weight of battles won and lessons learned. The legend of the Angel of Bagram was well known, but this young pilot had clearly not connected the story to the woman standing in front of him. "You're right. It's not the fastest plane in the sky," she says, her voice calm and steady. She turns to look him in the eye, a glint of steel in her gaze. "But speed isn't everything. Let me tell you a story about a ghost in a valley." The young pilot's smirk falters, a flicker of curiosity, of dawning respect in his eyes. The cycle was beginning again. But this time, the story was different. This time, the legend was already written. A testament to the quiet, unassuming woman who had taught the most elite warriors in the world the true meaning of courage. A woman who had painted hope in the sky with nothing but a battered old plane and an unbreakable will. The Angel of Bagram was home, ready to inspire a new generation to fly into the storm.